February 1945, the Crimean Coast, where three men gathered to reshape the world.
Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, seated at a table overlooking the Black Sea, deciding the fate of millions who would never know their names were being written into death sentences. The photographs show them smiling, shaking hands, toasting victory. What the photographs don't show are the train cars already being prepared, the camps expanding in the frozen east, the lists of names growing longer each day. This is the story of a promise made in sunlight and kept in darkness. The Yalta Conference lasted 8 days, but its consequences would echo for decades, in whispers too dangerous to speak aloud, in families torn apart by borders redrawn in secret, in the screams that no one was allowed to hear. History remembers Yalta as the moment the Allies divided Europe. What history forgets is what happened to those caught on the wrong side of that division. They called it Operation Keelhaul, a bureaucratic name for an unbureaucratic horror. Between 1945 and 1947, Allied forces forcibly repatriated over 2 million Soviet citizens back to Stalin's USSR. Soldiers who had been captured by the Germans, civilians who had fled westward, refugees who had spent years in displaced persons camps, all were gathered up, loaded onto trucks and trains, and delivered into the machinery of Soviet justice. Justice, that's what they called it. The repatriation agreement signed at Yalta seemed reasonable on paper. Soviet citizens would return home. German prisoners would be exchanged. But paper doesn't scream. Paper doesn't beg for mercy. Paper doesn't understand that in Stalin's Soviet Union, to have been captured was to have committed treason. To have survived German captivity was to have collaborated with the enemy. To return home was to face interrogation, imprisonment, execution. The Western Allies knew. British and American intelligence had reports, testimonies, evidence of what awaited these people. Yet the trains kept running, the ships kept sailing, and the camps in Siberia and Kazakhstan, in the Arctic Circle, kept receiving their human cargo. Imagine standing on a platform in Austria, or Germany, or Italy, surrounded by Allied soldiers you thought were your liberators. Imagine being told you're going home. Imagine the slow realization, as the train changes direction, as the faces of the soldiers become harder, as the borders pass and the landscape grows colder, that home is not where you're heading, that you've been sold. Some fought back. In Fort Dix, New Jersey, Soviet officers slit their wrists rather than board the ships. In Austria, families threw themselves from moving trains. In England, Cossacks who had fought against Stalin barricaded themselves in churches, until British soldiers dragged them out, beating them with rifle butts, loading them like cargo. One British officer later wrote in his diary, "We are delivering them to their deaths, and we know it." But orders were orders, and the promise made at Yalta demanded fulfillment. The filtration camps waited, sprawling networks of barbed wire and wooden barracks where returnees were processed, interrogated, categorized, not as survivors, but as suspects. The questions were always the same. How were you captured? Why didn't you fight to the death? Who else was in your unit? What did you tell the Germans? Where did you go? Who did you meet? The interrogators had time. They had winter. They had the patience of men who knew their prisoners had nowhere to go. Most were sent to the Gulag. The Great Terror of the 1930s had built the infrastructure. Now the post-war years filled it beyond capacity. Former Red Army soldiers found themselves mining coal in Vorkuta, logging timber in Kolyma, laying railway tracks across the permafrost. They had survived Hitler's war, only to become slaves in Stalin's peace. The irony was not lost on them. But irony doesn't keep you warm when the temperature drops to 40 below. Others simply disappeared. No trial, no sentence, no record, just absence. Families who inquired were told their loved one never arrived, or had been relocated, or was not in the system. The bureaucracy of erasure was efficient. Names vanished from lists. Files were destroyed. Witnesses were warned not to speak, and slowly, methodically, the history of what happened was buried under official silence. The Western Allies moved on. The war was over. New conflicts demanded attention. The moral compromises necessary to defeat Hitler were filed away, classified, forgotten. When journalists asked about forced repatriation, they were told it was a humanitarian gesture, reuniting families, fulfilling international obligations. No one mentioned the suicides. No one talked about the screaming. No one counted the dead. In the Soviet Union, survivors learned not to speak. To have been repatriated was a mark of shame. To have been in the West was suspicious. To ask questions about those who never returned was dangerous. So the stories stayed hidden, whispered between trusted friends, dying with each generation. The state had no interest in remembering, and individuals had no power to force memory. Decades passed. Stalin died. Khrushchev denounced some of his crimes. Brezhnev brought stagnation. But the story of forced repatriation remained locked away, in archives sealed to researchers, in testimonies given under classified conditions, in the memories of aging survivors who had learned that some truths are too dangerous to tell. It wasn't until the 1970s that Western historians began piecing together what had happened. Nikolai Tolstoy, a British historian, published research that shocked the public. He documented how British forces had forcibly repatriated not just Soviet soldiers, but entire Cossack communities, including women and children born outside the Soviet Union who had never held Soviet citizenship. He described the violence used, the deception, the knowledge among officers that they were condemning people to death. The documents he uncovered were damning. Memos acknowledging the fate awaiting returnees, orders to use force if necessary, reports of suicides and resistance, filed away and forgotten. The British government initially denied everything, then minimized, then quietly admitted that mistakes had been made. Mistakes. That was the word they used. In Russia, Glasnost finally allowed survivors to speak. Old men and women came forward with stories they had kept silent for 40 years. They described the filtration camps, the interrogations, the years in the gulag, the stigma that followed them even after release. They spoke of friends who never made it home, of mass graves in the forests of Siberia, of the psychological torture of being treated as traitors by the country they had fought to defend. Alexander Solzhenitsyn gave voice to their suffering. In The Gulag Archipelago, he devoted chapters to the fate of repatriated prisoners. He wrote of how Soviet soldiers liberated from German camps were marched directly into Soviet camps, how the very act of survival was considered evidence of collaboration, how men who had endured years of Nazi brutality were broken by Soviet interrogators, demanding confessions of treason they had never committed. The numbers are impossible to calculate with precision. How many died in the camps? How many were executed upon arrival? How many simply vanished into the vast emptiness of the Gulag system? Estimates range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million, but numbers cannot capture the full scope of the betrayal. Each digit represents a life, a story, a family destroyed by a promise made in Yalta and enforced with guns and barbed wire. Consider the Cossacks. Communities that had fled the Bolsheviks in the 1920s, settled in Europe, built new lives. In 1945, they were told they would be resettled away from Soviet forces. Instead, British troops loaded them onto trains bound for Austria, where Soviet officers waited. The Cossacks knew what this meant. They fought. They pleaded. They held up their children and begged for mercy. British soldiers followed orders. Families were separated. Men were shot trying to escape, and the trains rolled east, delivering an entire people to extinction. Or consider the Vlasov army, Soviet POWs who had joined the Russian Liberation Army to fight against Stalin. They were promised they would not be repatriated. They surrendered to American forces in Czechoslovakia, believing they would be protected. Instead, American troops disarmed them and handed them over to Soviet authorities. Within weeks, most were dead. General Vlasov himself was hanged in Moscow, along with his senior officers. The rest disappeared into the camps. These were not accidents. These were not oversights. These were calculated decisions made by military and political leaders who understood the consequences. The Western Allies chose alliance with Stalin over the lives of people who had trusted them. They chose geopolitical stability over humanitarian obligation. They chose convenience over conscience. And they chose silence over accountability. The legacy of Yalta extends beyond the individuals betrayed. It established a precedent that human rights are negotiable, that promises of protection can be broken when politically expedient, that the powerful can trade the lives of the powerless without consequence. This precedent would be repeated in Hungary in 1956, in Czechoslovakia in 1968, in countless Cold War compromises where moral clarity was sacrificed for strategic advantage. Today, the filtration camps are gone, the barbed wire has rusted away, the wooden barracks have collapsed into the permafrost. But the questions remain. How could democratic nations participate in such systematic betrayal? How could soldiers who fought for freedom enforce captivity? How could leaders who spoke of liberation preside over mass enslavement? The documents exist now, declassified, available to anyone with the patience to read them. They tell a story of moral failure on a massive scale, of bureaucracies that prioritized efficiency over ethics, of political calculations that treated human beings as bargaining chips, of Allied commanders who convinced themselves they were just following orders, the same excuse their enemies had used. But documents are not memories, and archives are not justice. The people who were betrayed, the families who were destroyed, the children who grew up without parents, they received no apology, no compensation, no acknowledgement. They were written out of the triumphant narrative of World War II because their suffering complicated the story of Allied victory. Some survivors are still alive. Old now, their numbers dwindling each year. They carry with them the knowledge of what was done. They remember the promises that were broken. They know that history as written in textbooks bears little resemblance to history as they lived it. And they know that Yalta was not about freedom, or democracy, or the rights of nations. Yalta was about power, about spheres of influence, about great men making great decisions while small people paid the price. The Black Sea still crashes against the Crimean coast. The palace where the conference was held still stands. Now a museum to diplomatic triumph. Tour guides speak of the alliance that won the war. They show the room where the agreements were signed. They display the photographs of Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin, three leaders who shaped the modern world. What they don't show are the camps, the graves, the silence that descended over millions of lives, the ghosts that still walk the frozen spaces where people were sent to be forgotten. Because some promises are made to be kept, and some people are meant to remember them, even when the world chooses to forget. Yalta, 1945, the promise that betrayed millions, a conference that lasted 8 days, and a betrayal that lasted lifetimes. The photograph showed men shaking hands. History should show what their handshake cost. The question is not whether we can uncover this truth. The question is whether we have the courage to face it, and to ask what other promises, made in rooms we will never see, are being kept in ways we will never know until it is too late.